Partly to show you the Digital Pali Reader, how it's used, and then also I found a good site where they have on one page, one by one, in order, the Dhammapada, full verses, and then its story. So I thought what it would be good to do would be to see, like, of the Dhammapada or of the Digha Nikāya, 10 of them, and just have a look at them and see what's there. Those 10 stories, or the Majjhima Nikāya, just look 10 stories and see what's there. Of the Samyutta Nikāya, and look at 10 of them, sort of sampling of each of them to see what it's about. So, how is your concentration and energy at the moment? Hanging in there? Okay, good. So, Dhammapada is probably one of the easier ones to show you also how to find the here. So these are the books, the Digha Nikāya, the 33, Majjhima Nikāya, Samyutta Nikāya, and Anguttara Nikāya, the number ones. Khuddaka is the sort of treasure trove. Dhammapada here. So this is the first, this is the Pali language that the Buddha used. Manapabangama Dhamma, Manosata, Manomaya, Manosata, Manasache, Padutena, Vasatiwa, Karotiwa, Tato Nang Dukkha Manchevi, Chakang Vahato Padang. So I'll read you, I'll show this other site as the, so this is the structure of the Dhammapada. Once you click on it, the yamaka is the pairs. You have all of these ones where the unmindfulness chapter, the mind chapter, flowers chapter, the fool's chapter, the wise chapter, enlightened one's chapter, and so on. So they've got all these chapters, and each of them they have about 10 stories in. So the big ones, one verse, one story. At tipitika.net, really worth looking at. You get the Dhammapada and its verses, and it looks like this. So this is Dhammapada verse 1, Chakku Pala Theravatu, and I haven't picked them out for being brilliant. But you can pick out the sort of juiciest ones that are very fun, and everything. I thought it would be good just to go down 10 so that you can also see the variation, because it would be like to say everything in the Thera books are all fascinating, hilariously good fun and excellent, publishable material. It's not. I love it. A lot of it is really dry and confusing. So I thought it would just give you a sort of fairly unbiased like this. So I just read through the Pali, and it means this: all mental phenomena have mind as their forerunner. Manopamangama Dhamma. They have mind as their chief. They are mind-made. If one speaks or acts with an evil mind, dukkha follows him just as the wheel follows the hoofprint of the ox that draws the cart. So that kind of says it in a lovely sort of poetic way of saying that previously thing, that you've got perception as the beginning bit, and that causes the mind state and so on. And then, I won't read the subnote, just the story. So then there's a story of Chakkur Tera Chakka. While residing at the Jetavasman, the Buddha versed one of this book, a blind monk on one Tera Chakupala came to pay homage to the Buddha at the Jetavana monastery. One night, while pacing up and down in meditation, the Tera accidentally stepped on some insects. In the morning, some bhikkhus visiting the Tera found a dead incense. They thought ill of the Tera and reported the matter to the Buddha. The Buddha asked them whether they had seen the Tera killing the insects. When they answered in the negative, the Buddha said, well, just as you had not seen him killing, so also he has not seen those living insects. Besides, as the Tera had already attained arahantship, full enlightenment, he could have no intention of killing, and so was quite innocent. On being asked why Chakupala was blind, although he was an arahant, the Buddha told the following story. The Chakupala was a physician in one of his past existences. Once he had deliberately made a woman patient blind, and she hadn't paid him properly. The woman had promised him to become his servant, his slave, together with her children, if her eyes were completely cured. Fearing that she and her children would have to become servant slaves, she lied to the physician. She told him that her eyes were getting worse, when in fact they were perfectly cured. The physician knew she was deceiving him, so in revenge he gave her another ointment, which made her totally blind. As a result of this evil deed, the physician lost his eyesight many times in later existences. And then the Buddha repeated the verse. At the end of the discourse, 30,000 bhikkhus attained arahantship. Together with analytical insight, patisambhida, it's a very important term, which means they understood the dependent origination. Some people just get it, but they can't understand what they got. Some people can. So that's a typical one. Second one gives you another taste of it. I won't read the Pali. That is about Mata Kundali, Batu. All mental phenomena have mind as their forerunner. They have mind as their chief. They are made. If one speaks with a pure mind, happiness will always follow like a shadow that never leaves him. The story of Matu Kundala. While residing at the Jetavana monastery in Savatthi, the Buddha uttered verse 2 of this book with reference to Mata Kundali, a young Brahmin. Mata Kundali was a young Brahmin whose father, Adina Kupakana, was very stingy and never gave anything in charity. Even the gold ornaments for his only son were made by himself to save payment for working machine. When his son fell ill, no physician was consulted until it was too late. When he realized his son was dying, he had the youth carried outside onto the veranda so that people coming to his house could pay respects. Would not see his possessions. On that morning, the Buddha, arising early from his deep meditation of compassion, saw in his net of knowledge Mata Kundali lying on the veranda. Like when the Buddha meditates in the morning, he just sweeps the landscape. He can spot where people are ripe for enlightenment or what's going on. So when entering Savatthi for alms food with his disciples, the Buddha stood near the door of the Brahman, Adina Pubaka. The Buddha sent forth a ray of light to attract the attention of the youth, who was facing the interior of the house. The youth saw the Buddha, and as he was very weak, he could only profess his faith mentally, but that was enough. When he passed away, with his heart in devotion to the Buddha, he was reborn in the Tavatimsa celestial world, heavenly realm. From his celestial abode, the young Mata Kundali, seeing his father mourning over him at cemetery, appeared to the old man in the likeness of his old self. Some devas can do that. He told his father about his rebirth in the Tavatimsa world and also urged him to approach and invite the Buddha to a meal. At the house of Adina Pubaka, the question of whether one could not be reborn in the celestial world simply by mentally professing profound faith in the Buddha without giving in charity, meant physical charity or observing the moral precepts, was brought up. So the Buddha willed that Mata Kundali should appear in person. Mata Kundali soon appeared, fully decked with celestial ornaments, and told them about his rebirth in the Tavatimsa. Then only the Buddha, the audience, became convinced that the son of the Brahmin, Pubaka, was simply devoting his mind to the Buddha, had attained much glory. And then he repeats the verse. And at the end of it, the stingy father attains stream entry, which is the first level of the mighty world. So this is what I mean, that they give you a little bit of a verse that is kind of a summary, but the stories give you a nice, readable little insight. Tissa terra vatu, akochi mang agvadi mang, ajina mang ahasi mang, yecha terra upanayang varang harang. He abused me, he ill-treated me, got the better of me, he stole my belongings. The enmity of those harboring such thoughts cannot be appeased. The story of Terra Tissa. While residing at the Jetavana monastery in Savatthi, the Buddha uttered verse 3 and 4 of this book with a reference to Terra Tissa. Tissa, the son of the Buddha's maternal aunt, his mother's sister, was at one time staying with the Buddha. He had become a bhikkhu only in his old age, but he posed as a senior bhikkhu and was very pleased when visiting bhikkhus asked his permission to do some service for him. So the bhikkhus would turn up and they could say, "We can do anything." He would get very swollen up about it. On the other hand, he failed to perform the duties expected of junior bhikkhus. Besides, he often quarreled with the younger bhikkhus. Should anyone rebuke him on account of his behavior, he would go complaining to the Buddha, weeping, very much dissatisfied and very upset. The others also followed him to the presence of the Buddha. The Buddha told them not to harbour thoughts of enmity, for enmity could only be appeased by not harbouring enmity. Simple little guideline. Let it go. But it's a kind of little one-liner. He abused me. He'll freak. Everyone gets on their mind. So if you're going off to meditate on a retreat, that might be like right in your mind at the time. Might bother a brother or sister or ex-boyfriend or whatever was would really like on your head, and you just can't let it go. And you're determined to write the letter or to confront them or to sort of report them to the police or whatever it is. And this can be the advice you're looking for. It's just like, let it go, because you'll never get to the bottom of it all just by harboring it. And are you actually harboring it? Like someone who said something 30 years ago, 25 years ago, 15 minutes ago, are you harboring it? Are you keeping hold of it? So again, bringing it to life rather than just the numerical theory. But you've also got the numerical theory to relate to. So the fifth of the Yamaka Vagga, the first of these, and there are 500 of these. Dhammapada verse 5, Kala yakini vatu. Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. It is appeased only by loving kindness. This is an ancient law. The story of Kalayakini, while residing at the Jetavana Grove in monastery in Savatthi, the Buddha uttered verse 5 of this book, and with reference to a certain woman who was barren, couldn't have babies, and her rival. Once there lived a householder whose wife was barren. Later he took another wife. The feud started when they lived together. The feud started when the elder wife caused abortion of the other one, who eventually died in childbirth. In later existences, the two were reborn as a hen and a cat, a doe and a deer, and a leopardess. And finally, as the daughter of a nobleman in Savatthi, and an ogress as a yaka, ogress named Kali. The ogress, Kala Yakini, was in hot pursuit of the lady with the baby, when the latter learned that the Buddha was nearby, and the one who's running away, giving a religious discourse at the Jetavana monastery. She fled to him and placed her son at his feet for protection. The yaka, the ogress, was stopped at the door by the guardian spirit of the monasteries. There's a deva that lives at the gate, like your gates here, and was refused permission. She was later called in, and both the lady and the ogress were reprimanded by the Buddha. Should actually say the name for a ogress is a yaka, and there was a tribe of people called Rakshasas in the area. So it could also have just been mystified along the way. And the guardian spirit, Devas, there was also a tribe of people called Devas, and it could have been that as well, but it's probably mythological language. She was later called in, and both the lady and the ogress were reminded by the Buddha. The Buddha told them about their past feuds as rival wives of common husbands, as a cat and a hen, as a doe and a leopardess. They were made to see that hatred could only cause more hatred, and that it could be only ceased through friendship, understanding, and goodwill. There you go. And then the end of the discourse, the yaka, the ogress, was established, got stream entry, and the long-standing feud came to an end. Sixth one. People other than the wise do not realize when in this world we must all die. We in this world must all die. And not realizing it, continue their quarrels. Wise realize it, and thereby their quarrels cease. Story of Kosambi bhikkhus. These are really famous at squabbling. And as I understand, actually the whole squabble started off from at the toilet. They have a water pot, and they all squabbling. You're supposed to leave that filled up with water. I'm not going to leave your water for you. So this went on and on until half the country were squabbling about this one little incident with their toilet pot. And the Buddha was constantly coming in and trying to calm them down, like squabbling monks. Until he gave up, he just said, look, forget it. I'm going to go off and meditate. The story of Kosambi bhikkhus, while residing at the Jetavana monastery in Savatthi, the Buddha, verse 6 of this book, with reference to the bhikkhus of Kosambi, the bhikkhus of Kosambi had formed into two groups. One group followed the master of Vinaya, the monks' rules, and the other followed the teacher of the Dhamma, what we're doing, learning the stories. And they were often quarreling among themselves. Even the Buddha could not stop them from quarreling. So he left them and spent the rain season, the Vasa residence periods of the rains, all alone in Rakita Grove in Palayaka Forest, so named after me. They got the elephant, Palalaya, waited upon the Buddha. The late disciple of Kosambi, on learning the reason for the departure of the Buddha, refused to make offerings to the remaining bhikkhus. This made them realize their mistake, and the reconciliation took place among themselves. They stopped arguing. Still, the lay disciples would not treat them as respectfully as before, until they owned up their faults to the Buddha. But the Buddha was away, and it was in the middle of the rain season, so the bhikkhus of Kosambi spent their rains in misery and hardship. At the end of the rains, the Venerable Ananda is the chief disciple of the Buddha, basically, and 500 bhikkhus approached the Buddha and gave the message from Anathapindika, who's a wealthy lay disciple, and other lay disciples, imploring him to return. In due course, the Buddha returned to the Jetavana Grove monastery in Savatthi. The bhikkhus followed him there, fell down at his feet, and owned up their fault. The Buddha rebuked them for their disobeying him. He told them to remember that they must all die someday, and therefore they must stop their quarrels and must not act as if they would never die. And the end of the discourse, all the assembled bhikkhus were established in stream entry on the path. Seventh one, he who keeps his mind on pleasant objects, who is uncontrolled in his senses, immoderate in his food, and is lazy and lacking in energy, will certainly be overwhelmed by Mara. Is all those 10 unwholesome mind states with the force that they create is personified of Mara, just as stormy winds uproot the weak tree. He who keeps his mind on the impurities of the body, who is well controlled in the senses, and is full of faith and energy, will certainly not be overwhelmed by Mara, just as stormy mighty winds cannot shake a mountain and rock. The story of Thera Mahakala. While residing in the neighborhood of the town of Stabharabhya, the Buddha uttered verse 7 and 8 of this book with reference to Mahakala and his brother Chulakara. Maha means great and Chula means little. Mahakara and Chulakara were two merchant brothers from the town of Sadabhya. While traveling about with their merchandise, on one occasion they had a chance to listen to a religious discourse given by the Buddha. After hearing the discourse, Mahakara asked the Buddha for permission to the order of the bhikkhus. Chulakala also joined the order, but with the intention of coming out of the order and to bring out his brother along with him. Mahakala was serious in his ascetic practice at the cemetery. They used to look at dead bodies and in the peace and quiet there, and diligently meditated on decay and impermanence. If you see corpses, then you reflect on your own brief life and how eventually this body that we're all so fond of will end up like that. You can get insight and fast move up the path. He finally gained insight and attained arahantship. Later, the Buddha he was fully enlightened. His brother wasn't. Later, the Buddha and his disciples, including the two brothers, happened to be staying in the forest of Singsapa near Satipatthana. While staying there, the former wives of Chulakala and Mahakala, the wives of Chulakala, invited the Buddha and his disciples to move to their house. Chulakala himself went ahead to prepare seating arrangements for the Buddha and his disciples. Once there, the former wives of Chulakala made him change into lay clothes. The next day, the wives of Mahakala invited the Buddha and his disciples to their house, hoping to do the same with Mahakala, as the wives of Chulakala had done to Chulakala. After the meal, they requested the Buddha to let Mahakala remain to express their appreciation. Anamotana. And so the Buddha and the other disciples left. Arriving at the village gate, the bhikkhus expressed their dissatisfaction and apprehension. They were dissatisfied because Mahakala was permitted to stay behind, and they were afraid that like Chulakala's brother, Mahakala too would be made to leave the order by his former wives. To this, Buddha replied that the two brothers were not alike. Chulakala indulged in sensual pleasures and was lazy and weak. He was just like a weak tree. Mahakala, on the other hand, was diligent, steadfast, and strong in his faith of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. He was like a mountain of rock. Then the Buddhist spoke in those verses. He always keeps his mind on pleasant objects, who's uncontrolled in his senses, moderate in his food, lazy and lacking in energy, will certainly be overwhelmed by Mara, just as stormy winds uproot a weak tree. He keeps his mind on the impurities of the body, who is well controlled in senses, is full of faith and energy, will certainly not be overwhelmed by Mara, just as stormy winds cannot shake a mountain of rock. Meanwhile, the former lives of Mara, Mahakala, surrounded him and tried to remove his yellow robes. The terror, the monk there, sensing their attitude, stood up and, rising up into the air by his supernormal powers, passed through the roof of the house into the sky. He landed at the feet of the Buddha at the very moment the master was coming to the end of his utterance of the above two stanzas. At the same time, all the bhikkhus assembled there were established in stream entry. Doesn't say whether they let go of the yellow robes when he did that. You don't know. You might have a bungee, friend with a crane at the same time. So supernormal powers. You never know whether to take things literally or just a story. Don't know, do we? 9 and 10, just to round it off. So this is a little bit of an introduction to what the Dhammapada is. Often you just see the verses, and it's not quite as readable then. They leave you wondering and pondering about the reading in between the lines. The lights, it's the same with the rules also. The rule, and you can understand what it's all about, but you read the story behind it, what happened at the beginning. He was not free from taints. So this is Devadatta Vatu. This is bound to be a juicy one, because Devadatta was the jealous cousin of the Buddha, always trying to assassinate him or take over the order, sneak some slimy strategy into, trip him up. And he who is not free from taints of moral defilements, that's actually the three triangle, which is a misperception, ignorant perception, craving, and grasping. That's the moral defilement, kilesas. He is not free from the taints of moral defilements, poisons, and yet dons the yellow robe. He lacks restraint in his senses and speaks not the truth, is unworthy of the yellow robe. He who had discarded all moral defilements, kilesas, who is established in moral precepts, is endowed with restraint and speaks the truth, is indeed worthy of the yellow robe. Just notes about how the colours made that. The story of Devadatta. While residing at the Jaifana monastery in Savatthi, the Buddha uttered verse 9 and 10 of this book with reference to Devadatta. Once the two chief disciples, the Venerable Sariputta and the Venerable Moggallana, went from Savatthi to Rajagaha. There, the people of Rajagaha invited them with their 1,000 followers to a morning meal. On that occasion, someone handed over a piece of cloth worth 100,000 to the organizers of the alms-giving ceremony. He instructed them to dispose of it and use the proceeds for the ceremony, should there be any shortage of funds, or if there were no such shortage, to offer it to any one of the bhikkhus they thought fit. So it happened there was no shortage of anything, and the cloth was to be offered to one of the terrors. Since the two chief disciples visited Rajagaha only occasionally, the cloth was offered to Devadatta, who was a permanent resident of Rajagaha. He was actually a monk, and he was actually quite clever in meditating. He had some, very strongly, powerfully developed abilities early on. He could transform himself into an animal and back. So he was quite developed, but then he started bitching about the Buddha behind his back and started to become clear that he had this sort of quite sneaky and evil side to himself. And he started to lose those abilities until he lost them altogether. But he was still quite a leader. Devadatta promptly made the cloth into robes and moved about pompously wearing them. Then a certain bhikkhu from Rajagaha came to Savatthi to pay homage to the Buddha and told him about Devadatta and the robe, made out of cloth worth 100,000. So probably had jewels and stuff. And so probably the Buddha, it wasn't the first time that the Devadatta was wearing robes that he did not deserve. And the Buddha then related the following story. Devadatta was an elephant hunter in one of his previous existences. At that time, in a certain forest, there lived a large number of elephants. One day, the hunter noticed these elephants, knelt down to the Pacceka Buddhas are private Buddhas. These are Buddhas who don't teach. Some of the Buddhas are very verbal and are teaching non-stop. Some just go to the shade of a banyan tree out in the Himalayas and they just sit there in 7-day long meditation. And then they'll go for food and then they'll do it over again. And they're silent private Buddhas. They stay alone. Notice that 3 of these elephants knelt down to the Pacceka Buddhas on seeing them. Having observed that, the hunter stole an upper part of a yellow robe and covered the body and hand with it. Then, holding a spear in his hand, he waited, and so he said, "It's all right." Held up the cloth like this. You've got this monk sitting there with golden robes on, probably fully wrapped, and he's seen them, the elephants coming up and bowing to them like this. So he's got the same kind of robe, and he's got a spear held up behind it. So when they kneel down, stab them through the yellow robes. It's a bit like some of the Vietnam War. They would have some dummy monks, fake monks walking along in line. They have sub-automatic machine guns, and the GIs would just walk past them, pay respect to them, and then they would open up and shoot. Very, very bad karma. The elephants came and, taking him for a Pacceka Buddha, fell down on their knees to pay obeisance. They easily fell prey to the hunter. Thus, one by one, he killed the last elephant in the road, each day for many days. The Bodhisattva, the Buddha, was to be then the leader of the herd of elephants. Noticing the dwindling number of his followers, he decided to investigate and followed his herd at the end of the line. He was alert and was therefore able to evade the spear. He caught hold of the hunter in his trunk and was about to dash him against the ground when he saw the yellow robe. Seeing the yellow robe, he desisted and spared the life of the hunter. The hunter was rebuked for trying to kill under cover of the yellow robe and for committing such an act of depravity. The hunter clearly did not deserve to be put on the yellow robe, and the Buddha spoke in verse as follows. He is not free from taints of moral defilements, yet dons the yellow robe, who lacks restraint in his senses and speaks not the truth, is unworthy of the yellow robe. He who has discarded all moral defilements, so is established in moral precepts, is endowed with restraint, and speaks the truth, is indeed worthy of the yellow robe. End of the discourse. Many bhikkhus were established. So, found fruition. Reading stuff like that happens well. There are lots of stories about elephants and things that happened when I was in Sri Lanka, and I'll tell you a very brief one that was kind of tickled me. But I was in a cottage that was about 20 minutes from the ocean, and you just got a scrub jungle all the way there, and it all looks the same. And I eventually found a way to get to the beach, and then there was like an ocean. So I took with me a yellow robe and white electrician tape, PVC tape, and put it on the bushes all the way there eventually. So I figured out this was a way to get there and back. And one day I was going to there, and I just couldn't find any of the white bits. And got all the way to the beach, and I was like, presumed that, someone had been irritated in a villager and taken them off. And I walked up the beach a little bit, and I found a big pile of these branches, and they were all ripped. And there was elephant footprints around. And this elephant, there was his territory. They'd come along, noticed that someone had been marking this, and they just ripped off all these things, taken them all up and chucked them on the beach. I was trespassing. Oh yeah, this was his birth, not mine. Path, not mine. So one good way to get into the teachings, this is what I like. Often first thing you meet when you go to southern Thailand, retreat center, and they'll teach you dependent origination. You'll be cross-eyed after 3 days of looking at, trying to figure out. And it's good to see these things that animate the stories and bring them to life and put them in context like that. Dhammapada stories is a good one, and that is a particularly good site where it's just got all of them, and you can sort of read them at your leisure. Easy to do, easy to find, free, translated by Burmese nuns. So I recommend that as a good way to do it. I recommend, rather than starting at the beginning, reading the Digha Nikāya and the Majjhima Nikāya things. I think the Dhammapada is a good place to get into it, because you can just read 2 or 3 of them and leave it. It's a good night reading, or something you're about to meditate. It's quite puts you in the right frame of mind. Another way is to listen to Dhamma talks. This site is a very good one. It's free, tons of teachers, loads of talks, downloadable, called Dhamma Seed. It was originally Barre, Massachusetts Insight Meditation Center, Jack Cornfield and Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg. They had lots of tapes, tape library. And then they started uploading them and then it digitized. And since then, they've just been expanding it. So if you go to teachers, this is also a good way to find your teacher. I might not be the right person for you, whatever. But when you go there, you can listen to, Kamala Masters, who's Filipino, Tara Brach. You can listen to Jack Cornfield, listen to Ajahn Chah, listen to Ajahn Sumedho. Some of them will just be in the right tone. You go, yes, and you might even like to go there. Or with U Pandita, I listened to loads of things, I said, that's what I want to hear. I want really dry, technical, detail, specific stuff. I don't want anyone in a candy floss. I really want the hard stuff. And he was the right guy for that. So this is a typical place to do that, where you A to Z of teachers, they've got everyone there, Org, Ujjanaka, U Pandita, Tanisaro, Vivekananda. Sometimes the way they write and they speak is quite different as well. Even sometimes the way they get talks in person, they're quite different as well, as I found out. He's quite different in person than in his talk. Loads, and those the amount of talks of theirs that are there. So if it was Ajahn Brahm one, they must have a Ajahn Brahm of Angso. But you just click on that and listen away. Tons and tons of them. So Larry Rosenberg, he's a very comfortable guy to listen to. That's what he looks like. Comes from sort of the Bronx, New York. Got a very nice listenable voice and very funny. And 284 talks on all kinds of subjects, including suttas, and those kind of subjects. Breath awareness as a gateway to living wisdom, awakening intelligence. Very non-sectarian, his type of stuff. Very open. And so on. Yep, so Dhamma Seed, and Larry Rosenberg is a nice, easy listen if you want to try some of those out, because there are hundreds of teachers there. That's a good starting point, good resource. And then you can just download any talk for free and keep it. But that's a good way to explore styles of teachers as well. YouTube's another one. But it's quite easy to stay focused. So the Digital Nikāya, are we okay for energy? People still on it? I'll keep repeating the sentence until you get that on the loop. So this is from something called Access to Insight. Should have it open on there somewhere. This one. Yeah, so this is, I'll just click it to the home page of this to show you where this comes from. This is a really useful thing. Now we've got the jumping cursor game again. Free, easy to use, and it looks like that. Access to Insight. And if you go to either one way is go to the site map, and here is Digha Nikāya, Majjhima Nikāya, Samyutta Nikāya, and Anguttara Nikāya. So the Dhammapada will be there, just the verses. So if you go to that, which is what I did to snap that last bit, Digha Nikāya, scroll down, you get a nice little synopsis of a sutta. King Ajata Satu asked the Buddha, what are the fruits of the contemplative life? He actually says, I can see what carpenters do, I can see what farmers do, I can see what they get out of it. He goes through tons of different jobs. And he says, but I don't see what the monks get out of it. So what are the fruits visible in the here and now? And then the Buddha goes very, 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 these are long suttas. These are like 40 pages long type suttas. It's not brief like those last ones. So it's rich, and it's just a frame story that the king comes up. Just a frame of story. But it's also a way of storing teachings rather than to be taken too literally. So when he talks about contemplative life, there might be 60 things. So it's not like the king sat there and go, really, really, really. It's not like a real life thing. It's just a frame story for listing the type of things that hundreds and hundreds, thousands of monks down the years need to read and learn and remember. So this is just to skim over the first 10, same as it did on the last one. Why are there so many? Why was it important to have 84,000? Well, it was teaching for 45 years. So, I mean, it not only just started off and had these few things to teach, it's tons of things happened and people went, did you hear what he said last night? You know, when that guy came up and was going to stab his baby in front of the Buddha did this and he said that. So stuff happened and miracles happened as well. And also all the ways that the nuns and monks did get it wrong and went off the path were all recorded, and how the Buddha got them back on again. So that's important for the future, keeping the whole thing going in order, so stacks of reference as well. The Buddha needed, he might have taught, and it just fizzled out after 30 years, but because it's so clear, it's so cross-referenced, it like, to me, Christianity, you know, no offense in Christians, it muddled, it's really hazy and difficult to make add up. It's only 3 years of teaching. And then the things that don't add up too well either, this really, really sort of cross-checks out with all the different characters, what they said and where they went, what they were saying. And it all is cohesive, partly because of this. After the 45 years, he said, I've done it. You know, I've woven the whole map. You know, it's ready. You don't need me anymore. It's going. And these stories were documented from, yes, yes, from the year 483. I think it's BC. All these things have been in around so long ago. Yeah. I mean, they didn't trust writing at the first time. At that time, they didn't trust writing, basically. They trusted memorization with 3 people who came together and verbally recite it very quickly. And if anyone missed a bit, they go back and find out why. So that's how they would do it. They get 3 independent teachers, get them to memorize it, and then they would come together with a test teacher in that year. They did it immediately, almost immediately after the Buddha died. They congregated a big council, and then the living people, the living friends of him, and the living who had been with him for very many years started to, you know, cross-memorize. And they had a photographic memory. Ananda had a photographic memory who could recall things perfectly. So a lot of them were stored away by him to do. One of them was the expert on the monks' rules. He'd already been teaching it for decades already, so he knew that very well, because he was using them as part of his teaching and referred to them all the time. But then they were systematically split it up to be recited and chanted and recited and chanted and recited and chanted. And it was only after a little while they started to write it down. As I say, it wasn't that trusted in their time, writing, but chanting and memorization was. So it was preserved by the monks where both directions, one is southerly, so it went down through India. So in all down India, like on the west coast, there were places there with the mountain locked and the teaching got preserved independently. So then you go down to Sri Lanka. They might have had wars in Sri Lanka. They would get independently stored there. Then it would travel by boat to Thailand and Suvarnabhumi, which is kind of like towards Indonesia. But that whole direction of transmissions, verbal transmissions, written transmission gets cross-checked against the versions that went around the Himalayas and up into China and stored up there. So that's all in the Chinese language. And now they have Australian monks who take the two totally independently. They got no idea they even existed, you know, and they would put them together and they cross-scan them for differences and any variations. But there's very, very few. They'll just say there's one page that's been put at the end where the rest of it is the same. Number of lines, number of words per line. Because it's Pali. Pali doesn't have a script like that. The Pali Reader, it was written in English, but the same sound would be written in Thai, written in Vietnamese, written in Laotian, written in Burmese, written in Chinese, written in Japanese. But the same sound is just the same. Ready? Let's quickly fly through these. Digha Nikāya 2. So this is the long discourses, just summary ones, just to show you that this is a way you can scan through to find out what was in there and why, what was it all about. So the first one, like that, the Digha one, King Ajahata Satu asked what the Buddha, so what do you get out of it? You know, basically, and he illustrates giving very vivid similes, what monks can get out and nuns can get out of being monks and nuns, and what's the benefit of it. Then he doesn't do all of these. So it skips from number 2 to number 9. Buddhapada is a character, this wandering ascetic. Buddhapada brings to the Buddha a tangle of questions concerning the nature of perception, and the Buddha clears up the matter by reviewing the fundamentals of concentration, meditation. You know, they might come up and go, I can't tell the difference between wisdom and mindfulness, or mindfulness and the soul, or is the soul got time and mind? And, you know, they come up with these questions, and the Buddha would give that map, basically, and clarify that map. All right, so there isn't a soul, you know. All right, I was assumed, you know. So a lot of it was to do with him giving out these kind of clarifications. The 11th one, Kevata Sutta, the discourse exploring the role of miracles and converse conversations with heavenly beings as a possible basis for faith and belief. So the Buddha does not then deny the reality of such experiences, but he points out that of all possible miracles, the only reliable one is the miracle of instruction in the proper training of the mind. As for heavenly beings, they are subject to greed, anger, and delusion. And so the information that they give, especially regards to the miracle of instruction, is not necessarily trustworthy. Thus, the valid basis for faith is the instruction that, when followed, brings about the end of one's own mental defilement. The talent that concludes the discourse, the tale that concludes is the early Buddhist sense of humor example, and essentially someone goes down and they're floating a golden pot in the air and trying to impress people and say, like, we get loads of people get back up to the monastery, we get really popular, and it's like using special effects in the movies or something. And the Buddha tells him right off and says, don't do that, you're just like a prostitute going and putting all your wares in the street. Dīgha Nikāya of number 12, is that something that still happens today? Meeting with the devas, is that something that some monastics do? Yes. Without going into too much detail. So it's not something just in the past, but something now. No, if you develop the Deva chakra, it's a specific practice to do it. It's one of the fruits of the contemplative life. If you do very much kasina practice, light kasina, and then that is the basis where you get very strong, powerful willpower to sustain on light kasina. And after a while, you start to be able to hear Deva celestials, music, sounds, communications, and so on, intuitions, advice. But again, the Buddha says not all devas are that smart. They might, you know, give you bogus information. Something they think is right is not a very good idea. So, like getting a message from anybody, any human being, could be totally wrong as well. Yeah, yes. Not just because they're devas, but because they're much more than that. To get into the Deva realm, you just do loads and loads of charity, but you don't necessarily have much wisdom and keep very pure morality. So you get reborn there, but you just as well, you might as well go into opera all their life and give lots of charity, and they swim into a sort of operatic celestial world, you know, like wonderful, but they're still quite dreamy and drifty, and they'll only last a while and come down, but they also might give advice. Digha Nikāya 12. Lohika. A non-Buddhist poses some good questions. If Dharma is something that one must realize for oneself, then what is the role of a teacher? Are there any teachers who don't deserve some sort of criticism? The Buddha's reply includes a sweeping summary of the entire path of practice. Digha Nikāya 15, Maha Nidana Sutta, the great causes discourse. Causes, what causes things? One of the most profound discourses in the Pali Canon, which gives an extended treatment of the teachings of dependent co-arising, Dhammapada, which I was telling her earlier, on the wheel and not self, and in an outline context of how these teachings function in practice. And then Digha Nikāya 16, the big one, Maha Parinibbāna Sutta, the last days of the Buddha. This wide-ranging sutta, the longest one in the Pali Canon, describes events leading up to, during, immediately following the death and final release of the Buddha. This colourful narrative contains a wealth of Dharma teachings, including the Buddha's final instructions that define how Buddhism would be lived and practiced long after Buddha's death, even to this day. But this sutta also depicts in symbol language the poignant human drama that unfolds among the Buddha's many devoted followers around the time of the death of the beloved teacher. Or the people take a tooth, they try to hide it, sneak off with it, they try to run off, someone tries to hand it under his turban, and all the stuff that goes on. Right? So just little, that's a little bit about the Digha Nikāya, and also a little bit about how you can use these things just to whet your appetite. You know, like that's interesting in a sort of, to get some introduction on where things are and how to find them, and what kind of things you can expect to find in there. So that's what it looks like in the Digital Pali Reader. So like we started with that, with number 2, but Brahmajala Sutta is one of those most important suttas as well. It's called the perfect net of views, 62 views that you'll always find people entangled up in, you know, believing in an eternal soul, or an infinite universe, or a semi-eternal universe, and a permanent soul, or all the different variations of oneness, or interconnectedness, or unity, or internal unity, or external unity, or all the different things, all the different variations, or they'll wriggle out of a discussion about what they're not sure about. This is called the Brahmajala Sutta, are very potent. Also about the formation of the universe, and how the formation of the Deva realms, and the formation of the Brahma realms, and how many Brahma realms are also formed empty. And then these great powerful light beings fall into them and stay there, thinking they're the only one. And then these other little devas come nearby, and they go, I just pushed you into being, wished you into being, and swell up, and they don't know there's other Brahma realms around. It's like thinking you're the only billionaire in Kazakhstan or something, is the only place in the world. It doesn't know there's other rich people in Alaska or London or Egypt or something. Why did they use the metaphor of the net? Like, what does that net, the net, well, partly because everyone's caught in it and entangled. And that's mainly the reason. If they don't believe in this one here, in, you know, the soul, the eternal soul, external soul, external, eternal soul, impermanent body, like oneness of unity, but the body is temporary. I don't mind if I get run over, because I'll just become one with the oneness. That's like one of them, one link of the net. But if you go across one link, you find a similar version, but slightly different, an up one and across one. But it's a net that you'll always find people's minds bound to that view. So it's like a symbol of entrapment. Yes, yeah. And eventually people will come and say, well, you know, what do you believe? Don't you believe in the Big Bang? Don't you believe in the steady state theory? And the Buddha will say, I don't have any views. Like, it's completely liberated from all of them. But you would always find other people caught somewhat in those. And because Nibbana, because all the views are made up from body and mind, Nama and Rupa. And what the Buddha realized was that Nibbana, which is neither material nor is it mind, and all of the views come out of the way that the matter and mind, and mind and mind, and matter co-affect each other, like that. All the views happen within that. But the Buddha realized Nibbana, which is neither material nor is it mind. So that's the first book, just to show you it and what it looks like when you've got all of them there, and that's how it comes out. Should we take a break? Yeah? So I appreciate you being able to bear with it. I know it's kind of academic and dry and so on. But this is hopefully to be able to give you some tools and see where you can get the authentic real stuff, partly in the authority version, but also in some of the sort of readable versions that we covered in the Dhammapada story. So let's go down, have a hot drink or something, and come back.